I think just the final moment of losing my mom to 15 years worth of breast cancer was enough to say that if I have 50 more years on this earth, I don't want to be this way. And I began to question everything.
Something super simple is just, hey, are your actions and behaviors taking you closer to or further away from who you are and what you want?
As these things I have chosen to believe do not serve me, and I can't verify that they are true. And if I can't verify that they are true, they have to go.
The concept is the second you protect yourself, you guarantee you're going to disconnect yourself from being seen and understood and being connected to the deepest level. And the second you protect yourself, you guarantee you're going to disconnect yourself from who you are and what you want.
I'm not saying there isn't an absolute truth. I'm saying we look at truth through our lens no matter what. Sometimes we think that showing up as ourselves is too much, but the reality is you are supposed to bring something to the table, and we need you to bring that to the table. And if you don't, we are missing out. There's a concept called the Imago Dei, the image of God, being created in the image of God. And one of the things I'm very interested in is exploring this idea that our core values might be how we reflect His character. It's not what you do that makes you impactful, it's who you are.
Welcome back to Flipping the Lid. You know what we do here. I love to have the real, raw conversations, get to the truth, help get people clear on the shared human experiences that exist. And we really only have some of the most impactful and influential people that are actually creating ripple effects of impact in this world. I love to have conversations to bring access to their wisdom, their experiences, their stories to you, and to make it accessible. Today, our guest fits all of those descriptions. In fact, pre-show, she even used the words deconstruction and reconstruction of self and all these moments of self-doubt. But really what she does today is it's an embodiment of who she is. It's a way that she channels who she is to help others get clear on who they are. It's the way that she's found clarity in herself and her values, in the way that she operates through the world that she now empowers other people with. Clarity is something that is king. And often we can find those if we're clear on who we are and what we value most. And so, Andrea, I'm super excited to have you here with us today.
Oh, Brian, what an intro. I'm excited to be here. I can't wait to meet this person you said you're talking to.
Yeah. I like to reflect the greatness I see inside people. And so I actually get excited when I hear that back, because oftentimes that's what clients will say to me as well. They're like, I didn't realize I was such a badass until I saw it outlined or I heard it reflected back. And yet at the same time, there's a difference between humility and being able to own our greatness, right?
Yeah.
And we can't always do that earlier in our lives. So I freestyle those narratives based on my interactions, the energy, and what I kind of feel, because that's how I see you, right? Independent of even the work that you do. But the one question I like to ask everybody on this show is, despite however I described who you are and what you do, who are you in your words?
I am a terminally curious, interested in just about everything person who just can't leave a stone unturned. I want to know why. I want to know what's beneath it all. I'm very interested in root cause analysis. And even in parenting my son, the first thing I say is, I understand what he did. I need to know why he did it. And so for me, being able to get down below that has not just changed who I am and changed the way I show up in the world, but that kind of changes how I do everything I do. Everything is based on that good old question, why?
Yeah. I actually really appreciate the way you even navigated that answer. And I find it interesting because you embedded even a lot of wisdom just even in that response, right? I mean, even the understanding of the separation between what someone does and why they do it, right? One of the things that I teach, and there's a framework around it that we talk about, is that the world will never judge you based on your intent. The world will only ever judge you based on your actions, right? So if you don't if you feel like you're not being seen, if you feel like you're not being understood, if you feel like you're not connecting, it's the first thing to do is to look here and actually ask, what are my actions and behaviors actually communicating, independent of whatever I believe I'm communicating, right? And that curiosity and wonder is real, and you embedded a lot of that in. Now, I find that why can be a never-ending perpetual circle.
Yeah.
That just keeps people going downward, right? And
yes.
And it can get a little dangerous, I find, in some levels of self-discovery, because some people ask why almost too far, to a place that they just become more aware of all the ways they should be judging themselves versus, again, understanding what to do about it. And so this no stone unturned curiosity that's so obvious in the way that you just explore identifying and connecting with people, why is powerful? When do you know when to stop asking why?
Well, now you're in my wheelhouse. And what I like to tell people is, if you look at why, and you look at the why of what you're doing, the very next question that you should be asking is the who is the doing the why. And so when I look at myself or when I look at others and the work that I've done, I even just presented this in a whole new way just last week to a group of HR people. Basically, understanding the why is really good, but if you don't understand the who below the why, that's the real root cause analysis. And so when I talk to people, I basically say, it's not what you do, even though behaviors tell the world what it is. It's not what you do that makes you impactful. It's who you are. The problem is what you do tells the world who you are. And so you need to be very cognizant of whether or not what you're doing is actually reflecting who you are. And so once we get to enough, like there's only so many stones to overturn, right? If you get to the place where you're turning them back over again, you've done too much. And if you're circling back on that. So what I love to say is take the why to a place where you start asking the who. And I think that's where you get to the real meat of it.
Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. I love even how you answered that question, right? I do believe that that's where people get lost, right? When they lack clarity on who they are, who they're doing this for, who they want to continue to become, who they want to impact, right? Like who they want to do these things with, and who before what is always important. So I actually appreciate the distinction because I've never heard anybody layer those three questions in the way that you just did. Why? Leading to who, leading to what, right? It's usually a shift or a pivot. And yet I completely agree. And I just want to say that was awesome how you responded to that.
Well, for me, there's like three basic pieces of my framework. And one of them that I kind of work within, and this is kind of where I landed for myself, is you need to know who you are. You need to know why you do what you do. And you need to know how you do what you do, which can either be life principles or how you communicate it. So that's how those three things work together for me. And they're almost a circle that just keeps perpetuating itself.
Yeah, and leads to deeper understanding if you keep looking at it through curiosity like you, right? Because again, it's your actions and behaviors reflect something and you recognize where or however you're out of alignment. You articulate the concepts that I believe are universal truths. We teach the same things in lots of respects through different language, and it makes it accessible to different people. But again, even the why and the who are important questions for you. Right? You have this focus with a very clear why, but before we get there, give us a little bit of insight into who you were, who you ultimately evolved through that gave you the connection, the purpose, the credibility, the wisdom, the understanding to be able to now help other people explore the why. I'm assuming lots of reasons why you do these things. Who are you and what is your why?
Yeah. And so I'm going to start with just a little bit of history. I'm going to tell everybody out there, I'm 58 and I spent 50 years in what I would consider a state of kind of disempowered movement, right? I managed to take on everything that was told me was the right and good way to do, the way you show up in the world, the way you're successful. Some of it came from evangelicalism. Some of it came from just the good old Protestant work ethic. This is how we do things. This is what success means. These are the bars that you need to strive to hit or overcome. And realized after finally looking back after 50 years when I lost my mother, that was a very much of a crucible moment in my life. I had an 8-year-old adopted son and I was in a decent career in higher education. I spent 28 years in medical schools, basically working in administration, operations, and research, and knew that that's not what was fulfilling to me. And I knew that there was this cognitive dissonance, this constant friction that I just couldn't make things work. I couldn't put puzzle pieces together anymore. Things didn't matter anymore. And I just found myself getting angry. And I mean, if you can't see me on video, I've got a shirt on that says happy. I mean, that's not who I wanted to be. I am a very naturally realistic person. When I ask why, I really want to know. And so growing up in that atmosphere where I had all the answers and all the paths laid out for me, it was very easy for me to follow along. But the more questions I had and the more cognitive dissonance I discovered or felt, the deeper I went on those things. Like the more perfect I wanted to be, the more conservative I wanted to be, the more Christian I wanted to be, the more good wife, good mom, good whatever I wanted to be. That doesn't work ever. And I hit a point where even though I had been through bulimia and depression in my teens and 20s, that wasn't enough to wake me up. even though I had lived through gastric bypass and I had lived through, because that was my coping mechanism, even though I had lived through adoption because I went into early menopause, none of those things were enough of a wake up. And I think just the final moment of losing my mom to 15 years worth of breast cancer, was enough to say that if I have 50 more years on this earth, I don't want to be this way. And I began to question everything. And when you're questioning out of curiosity, that's a very different process than questioning out of, what is the word I would use? Maybe if you think of something, feel free to shout it out.
Judgment.
Well, yes. Or, feeling like I had been duped. Right. Feeling, I went through a period of time where I felt like the entire world had gaslit me.
Yeah.
And because nothing was working out the way anybody said it would. And I finally hit this place where I said, you know what? I have to be willing to leave all of it behind. I have to be willing to shed every single belief that I have, every single, expectation that I have. And it just put me on this road of what do I want to stand for? We talk about how our behaviors matter. And I started with that. I said, what do I want to stand for? Who am I? And so when you look at my website, you're going to see it's called The Intentional Optimist. That's the name of my business. And that is a result of coming up with these life principles that I said I wanted to embody. Some of them are natural for me. Some of them are aspirational. And that's the 6 tenets of intentional optimism is where I started. And then I decided I would be a coach. And I started looking at who am I and what are my values and how do I coach other people, and realized that I had done some core value work back in my 20s and I didn't understand what that was. And when I really started looking at things, I realized where a lot of my cognitive dissonance was coming from. And it was from this idea that I really just don't want you to tell me what to think. I just don't. And so when I got to those places where I said, all right, so if I don't want any of these prominent, theologically famous, ecclesiologically famous, like denominationally famous people, if I don't want them to tell me what to believe, who's going to? And so, of course, this was in my faith journey. And that's really where a lot of it started. And I kind of made one of those deals with God, like a lot of people do. And I said, all right, I'm going to walk right out to the edge, and I'm willing to walk away from this and say, I don't even think you exist. And if you're there, you'll take care of me. And I never stopped teaching Sunday school through this whole process. My husband's a pastor too. I never stopped staying, with my own spiritual practices, but they had to be reexamined. And what I found, Brian, was leaving behind the external trappings of all of this stuff only made me more confident, only made me more devoted, only made me understand what I really believed my faith was, which then, and I spent days. There were days I would cry on the floor. My sister called, and because my parents were missionaries, my brother-in-law is a deacon. I'm denominationally, I am 3-4 generations in a pretty big denomination as far as leadership is concerned,
which is huge with everything you're talking about.
And I'm still there, right? My husband is still a small church pastor, but the other thing that happened in 2017 was we live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the Unite the Right rally came through here, and it changed us. I found it very interesting to see people that did not have their belief system challenged through that process, but it really did. And so my husband and I both have been on this journey. But for me, it gave me the ability, after my sister called and said, are you okay? Because I go really silent. I don't know about you, but when I'm really dealing with something, I do what I call turtling. And I just kind of pull inside. All the extremities come inside the shell, and I just take care of myself. And I was doing that in this process. And because she basically said, because we got people in our family that think you might have lost your religion. I'm like, yeah. And nobody but you has called me.
Yeah.
And but no, I haven't actually. And I think now that I'm just much more comfortable talking about it, and they see that I haven't, but that was the basic piece that helped me to say, all right, well, if that huge area of my life, because I use a life wheel that, like Zig Ziglar used. And I say, well, if there's faith and there's relationships and there's whatever, if that piece, which turned out to be a huge piece, was something that I needed to do this with, what else do I need to do this with?
Exactly.
And so it's put me kind of on that path. And in doing so, I've learned to be very transparent. I've learned to be vulnerable, but it's given me, we talk about wanting to see from other people's perspectives, but doing something like that gives you the ability, because you're not only seeing other people's perspectives,
Yep.
but for me, I'm literally on the other side of the fence than what I used to be on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet here I stand with my faith intact. So that's a lot of what drives me. You don't need to be a person of faith to work with me or to listen to me, because that's not, I even spent time working in the music industry, the Christian music industry, but I don't think that I need to proselytize through that. I just know that my authenticity is going to shine through, and people are going to be drawn to that. And if they're people of faith, they'll be drawn even more. And that's kind of where I got to where I am.
It's extremely powerful. And there's a few components in there that I want to go deeper on and unpack. But towards the tail end of you talking, it popped into my mind very, very, very clearly that I wanted to read you something that I just wrote this morning and posted, actually.
Okay.
And then I want to explore, because there's you again embedded a ton of power in that. But I said, rigidity rarely produces anything but resistance. Closed eyes, closed hearts, and closed minds rarely lead to understanding and acceptance. Belief that your belief is the only acceptable belief will rarely provide you a joy, freedom, and fulfillment. What's worse than belief is the idea of knowing. All these concepts create fear and anger. So I ask you, when has fear and anger ever served you? Everything you want is just on the other side of fear and anger. If you know all beliefs can change and are open to learning, you may be surprised by how many different beliefs actually align with your own. When you open your mind and open your eyes, the hardest to open the heart becomes easy. When resistance becomes flexibility, freedom and fulfillment begin to flow.
I have cold chills.
It felt like the story you just told, right?
Yeah.
And a story that I lived in lots of ways too, right? And one area that I really, really want to focus, and I say this for lots of reasons based on what's going on in the country, going on in the world, is you so eloquently discussed the concept of faith and how deeply ingrained it gets into identity.
Yes.
And also how easily through whatever faith system that you operate in, the evangelical leaders' interpretations, and therefore the way that things become taught may or may not always reflect what God or the source or Allah or whatever whoever's listening to this identifies with, right? And so often what's funny is that the relationship directly with God happens with the individual, which also means that the interpretation of God's word is up to the individual. And so it's really beautiful, because I've helped many women unpack the concept of being a woman of faith and all of the dichotomies that adds on top of any of the shame that already exists around women being wives, mothers, working, all of the stuff that we know exists. But the faith side adds a layer of complexity. Mm-hmm. And I don't care what anybody believes or practices. I'm never going to tell someone what to believe, what to practice, what to believe in faith. However, you do need to understand how the interpretation being taught in the messages aligns with your own interpretation, and how those patterns have created areas that produce shame, criticism, judgment, and areas where you shut yourself off, which is not what I believe any God would intend. And so I really appreciated how you gave the whole story with the history of your family, being actively married to a pastor, teaching within the church, and while still allowing yourself to deepen your relationship with God, i.e. your faith, while actually improving and deepening the relationship with yourself. Those are, by the way, closely correlated. And so could you go a little deeper on the complexities of maybe some of the narratives that you found yourself trapped in, right? Through any of the stories that you told, but maybe with an emphasis on faith, right? And what was the process? You gave so clearly the questions that you would ask and how you would go, but what did that evolution process look like for you? Like more specifically?
So it started with kind of reflecting back on my childhood. I grew up as a missionary kid in Seoul, Korea. My dad was what we would call a student evangelist and then a field evangelist, and he would go down and do rallies and show the Jesus film. And this was in the 70s and 80s, and it was a different place to be. I haven't been back in a while and I need to go back. But in these small towns, a lot of times the churches had a female pastor, which was just fine if there was nobody, because, well, the reason why is because there's nobody else.
Yeah.
And so I'm also a DISC consultant, and I am by definition in DISC. Literally the term for my personality type is the leader. Okay.
So high D, high I.
I am an ICD. I'm an I. So yes, high D and high, but the C is in there too, which means I have all the details. So I can do the big picture and the small details at the same time, which felt schizophrenic until I understood that's a superpower, Yeah. But growing up with that, and then coming back to the United States when I went to college, and it was cat's out of the bag. I'm Southern Baptist, right? So coming back, being able to go to church and have people say, well, women aren't supposed to be pastors and women aren't supposed to be ordained. And why would women be in leadership? And I'm like, my mother was a volunteer for the American Red Cross in Seoul, Korea. And she actually ended up with a volunteer level GS-13, which is like a colonel, because she was over all of the volunteers of Asia and the Pacific. And she then took our 6 homes that were built on our compound that were built in the 1950s, I think, and was the project manager, right? Anybody who out there is a PMP, doing construction work for 16 townhomes. She did all of that in another language, in another land. Okay. But when they didn't retire. They came back to Richmond, Virginia, and my dad worked in the home office, and she went to get a job, and she got an administrative assistant job. And I'm like, you are a power stinking house. And she finally graduated from college after 14 different schools, because she put my dad through and all this stuff, with magna cum laude from University of Maryland overseas. So all of those things didn't add up for me. And yet, like I shared, the only way I knew, because I'm also an Enneagram 6, so the only way I knew to do it better was what you alluded to, was that I needed to know that I had the right answer. The right answer was the people who were giving them to me, I had to trust them. And if you know anything about Enneagram 6s, we either trust authority or we do not. And for the longest time I did. And now I do not.
I don't either.
and the 6 is kind of defined by the relationship to authority. And so for me, I went into this period of time where I completely jettisoned all of these things that felt natural to me. I just said, well, if I'm a Christian, there's only one way to be a real Christian. Even though I grew up in an ecumenical environment with missionaries from all the different Protestant and non-Protestant denominations, and kids in my Sunday school class in church. We had a Baptist church there that was an International Baptist church, and I had Presbyterian missionary kids in my Sunday school class. And in 10th grade, we were debating predestination. This is not kids who didn't understand theology, right? I mean, these are kids who are like legacy kind of, they're on the mission field, for crying out loud. Their parents,
having like literal conversation using discernment and understanding and perspective, like all the while. Yeah.
And so this is what I came from. But then when I came back to the States, I didn't really have a place to fit in. And so I jettisoned all of that. I was in Houston, Texas. So I guess you could figure out which direction I went. I became a college Republican. I joined a sorority, and I really started working to fit within the mold of this one place that could make me feel comfortable. And the more I tried to fit in, the worse it got. And so when I kind of hit this 50-year-old mark of this is garbage, and funny enough, I met my husband at seminary. So I have almost a master's of divinity. That's one of my goals for this year, is to actually get started back on that, to finish it and get a PhD.
Very cool.
But I met him, and one of the things that was interesting in our dynamic was he was not raised Southern Baptist. He chose it. And he was much more egalitarian, and I was much more of the, I was 100% in the complementarian camp. For those of you who are not familiar with that, egalitarian means women can do things in leadership, and complementarian means we're under the men's leadership. Okay. That's just it in a nutshell. And I basically told him he was too liberal for me. And if he wanted to marry me, then he was going to have to get on the conservative train. And so he did. And so years later, I look at him like, I'm so sorry. Why did I do that? And I said,
please unwind.
It's like, can we go and rewind that? But I I just didn't know any better. And this is my personality to be that leader in that space. I really just tried hard. So one of the first things in the process I had to do was say, I think all these things I've chosen to believe, and I love the way you said beliefs can change, because that's a major piece that people need to understand, is these things I have chosen to believe do not serve me, and I can't verify that they are true. And if I can't verify that they are true, they have to go. And that process scared the crap out of me. I mean, like I alluded to earlier, I spent days on the floor crying because this was everything. I mean, 50 years is a long time.
Your whole identity's wrapped up in it. Yeah. Ooh, it's deep.
And especially when you've consciously, and I'm the intentional optimist, so everything I do is intentional. And I had intentionally done this to myself and, quite frankly, to others. So I had to be willing to really look at the things that I believed. And I actually now call them my ABCs, my assumptions, beliefs, and conditioning. And so knowing that I have core values that I say are who God created me to be. We talk about, you talked about, I have so many things. You talked about having your relationship with God and your relationship with yourself, and they're so intertwined. There's a concept called the imago Dei, the image of God, being created in the image of God. And one of the things I'm very interested in is exploring this idea that our core values might be how we reflect his character, how the character of our creator, the imago Dei. I'm like saying that out loud for the first time here. I need to talk to some PhD people so that I can look at how I could maybe get this in my own PhD. But being able to say, I have to be willing to trust myself. I have to say these things might not be true, or I might have 5 things that I know are not true. And if they came from this one person, how many of the other things did they tell me are not true? And when you're willing to do that, and you're willing to say, it's okay for me to make the decisions.
That's right.
I have to give myself permission to be wise, right? Whenever and I still try my first initial response to somebody saying, you just departed so much wisdom there. I just like, oh, shucks, no. But I've stopped because I'm learning that the wisdom that I have from just being around the sun as many times as I have, it's real. And people come to us for wisdom, Brian. They do. And if we're not willing to share it, then we're doing a disservice. Yeah. And so that feels very roundabout. I probly went on too many.
No, I think it was brilliant. I think it was brilliant. And there's again, just like you say, I have so many things like 15 different dingers went off, like every answer you've given. And I'm like trying to decipher where do I want to really explore, because I could explore truly in 50 different ways with you so far.
Well, can I say one more thing then?
Please.
Because one area that I think, going back to that permission, that it's okay to make these decisions ourselves. And you alluded to the idea that we can interpret things for ourselves. And what I find in my weekly, I teach a ladies Sunday school class, and now I've got them to where they are like digging deep and they want to know what the Hebrew says and the Greek. We don't have to all be scholarly.
Yeah.
But one of the things I realized is that I am one of a few people, and it's not necessarily because I have almost a master's of divinity. It's because I've been a Christian since my parents tell me almost, 3 years old, and they pushed me off until I finally said, no mas at 8. This is happening, But it's because I've been kind of in my Bible for a really long time, and I've been involved in the church for a really long time. But the lack of what I would call literacy of not just the Bible or whatever scripture you used or whatever teachings that you used, it's this having this good literacy of whatever it is you believe and you want to study. And then also being able to say, I can understand this. And if I can't understand it, I'm going to find out somebody that can help me understand it and find other people who are willing to ask the questions. So I think that's kind of fundamentally a piece that, especially in the American evangelical community, is that we have this illiteracy when it comes to what's in the Bible and what's not. I can't tell you how many people will tell me, cleanliness is next to godliness in the Bible. Right. And I ain't nowhere in the Bible. And there's a lot of things that we conflate with conservative politics or with even the hot button issue right now that are not in scripture. And if we are illiterate of the things that we are supposedly standing upon, there's no reason for us to be standing upon them.
Yep.
I can't be an economist without having studied economy.
I could not agree more on so many levels. I'm going to send you something that I wrote, a much longer thing that I wrote for my daughter actually last week. I'm going to send it to you afterwards because I think it will speak to you. There's a lot of directions I could go with it. What I want to sit with and what you just described is, I often say to people, don't let the lesson get lost in the language, right? So whether you call it God, the universe, the source, Allah, like I am the person at this point in my life that I identify more as faith-based just generally, because as I've studied multiple different religions, I often also believe that each and every one of them are the man-made construct of essentially the same thing through however it was interpreted by the people who were reporting it in that region or that belief system. Like, and then it's evolved, right? But often, again, intent is not how actions communicate it. And I really appreciate that that's also what you're highlighting is, again, explore. Even your story was around perspective. You had perspective that challenged what you saw, right? When you came back to the States, you had perspective that showed that these beliefs aren't congruent and real with what I've actually seen and witnessed in the world, right? Traveling to other countries, you get that exposure and perspective that opens us to some of the things that are important. You know, one of the things that really stuck out, and there's a lot we can explore in everything we've talked so far. I feel like my reason for existence is to allow my truth to give others permission to live theirs. And in a lot of ways, that's the passing of wisdom, the passing of lessons, like you suggested. You know, one of the things I was happy to see you lean into, and then I actually have a question on the backside of this. One of the things I was happy to see you lean into is even the recognition that you used to push away compliments, right? And you're now starting to be able to recognize and own what is true within them. You know, and that even concept and that inability to receive, right? I used to believe my love language was words of affirmation, but every time somebody would compliment me, I'd feel shitty about myself because I couldn't receive it. Right? Like even the practice, well, right. Like but like the practice of doing these things, right? Like that, it was even an intentional shift I started to make when I was energetically or verbally at least stopping it. I would just start saying verbally to people, thank you, I fully receive that. Just as the intent to allow myself again to change my pattern, change my behaviors, and explore what's true for me. Truth seems to be something that's not so clear anymore. I'm really curious, how do you teach people to discover, explore, and define truth for them? And also how to explore truth in this complicated external world that we live in?
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble with all my evangelical friends.
Go only as far as you're comfortable, my friend. You know,
No. That's completely tongue in cheek. Okay. For instance, what I came from was the Bible is the source of all truth. That is it. And coming out of being in the evangelical church post the inerrancy movement, if you're not familiar with that, it would be in the Southern Baptist Convention around the 80s, where the Bible took on the fight was over the Bible taking on this whole new definition of being true. And became literal. You know, it was like there was textual criticism was no longer okay. You couldn't question anything. This is kind of the birth of the young earth movement, where the earth is literally as old as we can calculate it from Genesis. And so post that, it's very difficult sometimes in a lot of faith spaces to be able to talk about truth because there's only one truth. And I'm like, okay, set that aside. But Tuesday night, we do our midweek study on Tuesday nights, and we're studying biblical backgrounds with some amazing ladies and turns out to be all ladies, and some really good teachers of N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. And one of the things that came up was these Old Testament, New Testament things seem to really kind of talk to each other. They prove each other. I'm like, well, they do, unless you don't think the Bible has any relevance. What do you mean? Like, now that's where we start, right? So why argue with people about what truth actually is when your starting point is different from theirs, right? If we're going to both run the 50-yard dash, but I'm starting on that side of the field and you're starting on that side of the field, it doesn't really matter unless we have, one stopwatch that can catch us both, there's not going to be a definitive knowing of the answer.
Yep.
I'm not saying there isn't an absolute truth. I'm saying we look at truth through our lens no matter what. And so when I work with people, I don't actually really talk about truth. I talk about my perspective. I talk about what lens am I looking through. Yeah. So you have on glasses, I have on contacts. We look through things. We look at things through a lens. And if we're not willing to understand, because I even had these conversations at church, right? People say, well, there's no such thing as my truth and your truth. I'm like, could you just plop in there, pull out the word truth and plop in there experience or reality or lived experience. And when we're talking to other people about whether or not something is true, I think in the realm of history or science, there are ways to verify certain things. In the realm of theology or even other science, even sciences like, or philosophy, these things are very subjective.
Yep.
And I don't know whether or not somebody else is going to come up with the exact formula for truth. I just am to the place where it's okay for me to say, I don't know. And that was the biggest, you mentioned that in your reading, like that's one of the reasons why I got cold chills, that thing that you posted today. I'm gonna have to go find it. But to be able to say, I don't know the answer, let's go look, that builds a trust with other people. It bridges the gap between whether or not we're going to agree on something. And you alluded to this in your post today, evidently, that gives us the opportunity to walk alongside each other and figure out where we need to go and why we need to do it. So I'm not really big on an absolute truth. For me, scripture is God's word. For you, it might be the Quran. Interesting point. Jesus is mentioned in there too. I mean, but if you don't have to be the one who knows the answer, I mean, 2 + 2 is 4, but if you don't have to be the one who knows the answer, because I don't, it's like, you can come at me with all these other things, like, but we're not talking about math, right? We're talking about life. We're talking about the way we live. And for me, almost every piece of information I receive, I then say, okay, how does this change the way I live?
Yep.
What then? How now shall I live? Right? Because the most important thing to me, and I have a wall plaque over there that my sister made me, it says collect moments, not things, is relationships with other people. You can't take whatever you earn with you. You can't take any of that with you. But I believe that the relationships, even in the evangelical, whatever happens afterwards, the Christian, it's like, that's what matters. It's the relationships are what matter. It's the soul talking to each other. So as far as working with truth, I don't play with that much because
I, no surprise, really appreciate all of what you even discussed. I mean, you talked about meeting people where they are. You talked about, like being able to allow and create perspective. You talked about, the shift from needing to be right to wanting to get it right. And having the best of intent. And all of that is embedded in that, and even the nuances of all of this. Again, I'll just to stick with this for one more second. I share this with you because it was an interesting moment to challenge perspective. I happen to have worked with a lot of faith-based people. I work with a lot of ministers and pastors, and it's because I can be objective and non-judgmental. And it's again about helping navigate for them what's real. But I had somebody ask me about 6 months ago. They said, could you please expand and tell me your opinion and beliefs on Jesus Christ of Nazareth? So I responded back instead of just answering the question. And I said, are you talking about Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the human? Are you talking about Jesus Christ the Nazareth, the religious figure? Or are you talking about Jesus Christ the Nazareth, the TV series?
Oh.
Because there is one called that, right? And again,
or the chosen, or whatever.
But the point was that it's like, I need to understand even what you're framing in the question before I can even begin to answer the question that I think you're asking, right? And at the end of the day, that even from a history and fact perspective, right? Jesus Christ was a human. There are documented proof and story, regardless if there's an attachment to that. And if you just look and study at how he chose to live his life, the actions and behaviors, the compassion, the kindness, the permission, right? The healing that existed, the connectivity, the sacrifice, the lack of ego, right? Like I look at all of that as a pinnacle for if we could all live like that, by the way, life would be a whole lot easier and better for all of us.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because that's even where it gets confusing, right? You can say that and study that about what's supposed to be the symbol for how to operate in many religious contexts. And yet the human, regardless of it, operated that way, which shows also it is possible, right? Yeah. Way back when it was also. And so I just really appreciate the nuance of how you navigate this, because it comes from curiosity. And I think curiosity is the greatest expression of self, right? And that's all what you doing in a lot of ways is helping people explore, is to get curious about themselves and actually ask those questions. I mean, that's where core values come from.
Right.
How often, I don't like to ask closed-ended questions, but I would like to understand maybe the journey of how lived experiences with lived values actually align with lived values in the people that you work with. And how do you start to bring clarity and alignment back into their reality through the lens of core values?
Sure. I define core values as internal motivations. They are not external. So when I do workshops or when I work with people, it's like, if you're telling me that faith, family, and whatever country are your values, those are your life principles or your lived values. Those are the things that you aspire to. They are not your core values. Your core values are your non-negotiables. They are the things that you cannot, like, if somebody pushes on it, you're going to push back, right? But it's also something that you want for the other person. Like when you said, oh, words of affirmation, I want to give them, but I have a hard time receiving them. Like, well, then it's not really a love language, because if it's really a love language, you mostly want to receive it. So when I work with people, I help them understand that their core values are things like, for instance, if respect is if top core value, then I want you to be respected as much as I want to be respected. And if it doesn't show up in your life that way, then it's not a core value, right? And so when people say, but I really value my family, that's awesome. Let's look at below that. What is motivating you in that family? Like, one of my top core values is belonging. For the longest time, I thought it was community. And when I understood the nuances of it and got down to what it is that I need, because when I said I felt like I was ostracized and I was afraid my family was going to kick me out, I was using my family as this idea for belonging. And then I realized, you know what? I belong to my nuclear family, my husband and my son. And then I'm like, oh, hang on. I belong to me. Ooh, hang on. And if you go to the field, I belong to Jesus. So when I work with my clients, one of the things I help them do is, and this is why I love core values coaching, and it's becoming my signature way of coaching, is I push back to help them see what's the motivation below it. What is that go down, down, down to say who you really are. And I have one client who strategic is her top core value, which sounds weird to me, but it manifested itself so clearly in her business. She had 3 businesses running, and she went on a personal retreat in the middle of our core values coaching contract or journey. And she contacted me and said, I'm closing this one business. She was in the middle of a launch, and she was one of those Marco Polo people who had like one of their ambassadors and everything. And she said, I have to shut this down. And I said, do tell. And she said, I was wondering why it didn't work for me. I was wondering what the pushback was. Why this time am I not enrolling anybody? And she said, it's because I've realized that honoring, and that's how I talk about it. I talk about honoring our core values. We don't align our core values with anything else. We align everything else with our core values, right? It's like, it becomes, and if you're not careful, it could sound very self-centered and selfish. But the reality is, if we want to honor ours, we want to honor everybody else's. But what she said was, I realized that doing this does not honor that core value of being strategic. I was just continuing to do it because it's what I had done in the past. And so she shut that part down and took over as the CEO of the company that she and her husband had created. And now she's like doubled the size of her business in like 4 months. And so to watch somebody take that and go from, I am so frustrated, I feel like I am just spinning my wheels and I don't understand what's going on, to understanding who they are. And now it affects the way she shows up in meetings. It affects the way she markets herself. She's completely changed her LinkedIn and everything. So to watch that in a very practical sense is so encouraging, because it just kind of gives credence to this idea that when we know who we are and how to honor that, we can then show up in a way that matters. And then I say, then you have to decide what your life principles will be.
Yeah.
Mine are the 6 tenets of intentional optimism. You can borrow them if you want. Sometimes we can start with somebody else's, and that helps us say, that's where I want to be. And it may be that that's enough for you. Or it may be like another client I had, solopreneur, consultant, works for herself. She took her core values and rewrote them into a mission statement for her business. And so for her, that's how it works for her, and it shows up for her in both a honoring and a lived out. She chose to do it that way. And, when I watch people do this, and I watch the light bulb go off above their head, and 9 times out of 10, they'll say, oh, I am the biggest culprit. I'm the one who's not honoring my core values. Just like you weren't willing to receive words of affirmation. We do it to ourselves, Brian, all day long, every day. And so that's the piece that I think is so important when we start looking, because if you just know stuff, it doesn't do you any good. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. If you know something, that's great. But if you actually put it into practice, you actually apply it, then it becomes wisdom.
Yeah. And I mean, even to that whole point on knowledge versus wisdom, how easily we can tie narratives to that, right? Like I used to literally believe I had a shitty memory because I, in moments under a perception of pressure or feeling like I need to have the right answer, know the answer, but would have blocks. And therefore I'd be like, God, I can't remember that stuff. But yet if I recognize that if I don't care about any of that, and I care about, again, speaking what's relevant with what's right in front of me, then it's not about accessing knowledge. It's about allowing wisdom to flow through. And again, it's the lack of resistance. So much of what you described too just highlights, like with clarity. I mean, the greatest sources of interference and resistance in our lives are a misalignment between intellectual and emotional narratives and actions and behaviors, or between our intents, beliefs, desires, and again, what our actions and behaviors are communicating in the world. And, that's one of the questions that I often will ultimately lead people down, because you can identify core values and then evaluate percentage of time, energy, and focus going into any of them. And oftentimes they don't align in terms of hierarchy of importance and priority as they state them. And so something super simple is just, hey, are your actions and behaviors taking you closer to or further away from who you are and what you want? It's almost that simple when you can start to recognize with clarity who you are and what you want. Are these things taking me closer to or further away? Are they creating more joy, freedom, and fulfillment? Are they creating more resistance? And it starts to become, to your point, this never-ending cycle of evolution. It's beautiful.
I use the analogy of either, cause when my son was little, he really liked to bowl. And so we would put those bumper guards in. So I say they can be bumper guards for you that will help you keep you in your lane, or they can even be, I drink like over a pot of coffee a day. No judgment. But
I don't judge anybody.
It's my vice. But having a good filter matters. Right. And I don't like the gold filters because too much of the residue comes through. I want a good like bamboo filter because I want the good, pure stuff to come through, and I just want it to taste good. And so your core values can either be, depending on how you operate, can be the bumper guards that keep you from going in the gutter, keep you on the road. Or they can be a filter through which you put all of your decisions and say, how is this honoring my core values? How is this helping me think for myself or understand belonging, or, and those kind of things really, it becomes so simple when you see it. But until you see it, you're floundering around without a clue.
It truly is simple, but not easy, right? And yet, you referenced earlier this idea of like, it could seem selfish. It's, being selfish and actually being clear on who you are, what you need, what you want is the least selfish thing you can do, especially for those who care about taking care of others, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. And if you don't even know how to fill your own, how are you going to help fill somebody else's perpetually? You're just going to be always extorted emotionally, financially, and no ability to set boundaries from a position of clarity. I always say armor protects pain, whereas boundaries are a communicated contract that exists on your clear existence. If you aren't clear on your existence, how do you ever communicate a boundary? You can't.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, language can mean things, and we put narratives around stuff. I love that you actually identify as an ADHD and critical thinking advocate as well. I would love to explore that concept with you. By the way, I'm probably highly neurodivergent, just undiagnosed. I have 2 neurodivergent kids with a whole bunch of different stuff going on that have taught me a lot about myself. But it's interesting because there's so many varying experiences and beliefs that still exist around it. I just love to understand your experience with ADHD and the concept of critical thinking and discernment.
So critical thinking and discernment is something that helped me, right? When I said all these things, I realized, here's 5 things that this person has told me and they weren't true. So what else is not true? And I had to learn to start saying, what do I think? Or put it through and say, is this true? Can I find out? I was one of those people back in the 90s that was going to Snopes.com, right? It's just like I needed to know what I was consuming. And so we're not really taught critical thinking anymore, especially in our school systems. My son is in the public school system. We have SOLs. We have project-based now, which is a little better. But I was raised with this, and I'm sure you were too. It's like we have to regurgitate whatever we learn on the test.
Rote memorization. That's all it is.
Yes. Yeah. And we are taught that way. And then we get out into, maybe we go to college, unless you go into like higher education, you're not going to get to a place in education where you're not regurgitating or you're taught to think for yourself. And so this is something that I feel very strongly about. And it goes to my top core value of freedom of thought, which is I get to think for myself. Please do so, right? Please, you do so. How can I help you do that? They go kind of hand in hand in this idea that if I have ADHD, I've not been told. Every time I think I might have ADHD, I go through and like talk to somebody or do a little test. It's like, no, you don't. Okay, well, I don't. But I'm an adoptive mother of according to the counselors, off the charts ADHD kid with the combined type hyperactivity and impulse control. I was trying to think which one was it.
Executive functioning, impulse control. Sounds like my kid.
Yeah. He's 16, right? Mm-hmm. So he's now 16, but we adopted him at 9 weeks. Looking back, I'm like, oh, this all makes so much more sense. But he was the kid that we had to swaddle him because he would literally like lay there to go to sleep and then shake himself awake. I mean, you've done it when you're like falling asleep in front of the TV or something so that you wouldn't fall asleep. And he did that at 9 and 10 weeks old. And then he was the rambunctious kid that we called him Captain Destructo. He would destroy everything because he was just like, and we're like, oh, he is all boy. Like I said, I am 58 years old. I was raised with the kids are seen and not heard. You do what I tell you.
Me too.
Yeah. This is how it works. Very, very, evangelical, very traditional. By the time, and fortunately, when we adopted him, I was able to work from home for a while. I was working for Johns Hopkins. My boss was amazing. And then my husband was a pastor there, but he decided to take a couple years off as a writer. And so he was kind of a stay-at-home dad. And so we had at least one person in the home. But then when he hit kindergarten, it was like, nope. So the principal at the school at the time, told us that we needed to have him evaluated because he thought he had oppositional defiant disorder. And I'm like, well, I looked it up and I'm like, what the heck?
Yeah.
And of course my mom said, I bet he's got ADD, and she didn't mean for it to be derisive, but it was. And of course we're like, no, he doesn't. He's just all boy because we didn't know any better. And we had no exposure to ADHD at all. Well, my husband was a journalism major or a poli-sci journalism major and was an investigative reporter before he became a pastor. So he said, well, let's check this out. And I fortunately was working at the University of Virginia at the time. I had a colleague that we could take him to. So we started going to both a psychologist and a developmental pediatrician at the same time. We did not want to start medication. We were like, he's overstimulated as it is, because we had no clue what that meant. And so we just dove in and said, how can we learn? And we just went on this journey of how do we become parents for this child? Because in our minds and in our hearts, God placed him in our family. This, at the very least, his birth mother placed him in our family, right? So a human being trusted me with her child. I need to do a darn good job at this. And one of the things we discovered was that adoptive parents tend to do a better job because they feel the same thing. Yeah. But we went on this journey where we discovered that the way that we were taught to parent is no-go, right? Just doesn't work. And some of it is, like I said, 50 years in the making. And so at 43 or 42, how old was I when I got 42, 43, I already had a very determined style of how I communicate and everything. So we had to learn a lot. And we got his diagnosis before he left kindergarten, but he was suspended from the bus because he went out to the bus line and was really curious and like went underneath the bus. And, you know, that's not safe. You can't do that. You look like you have experience.
Deeply identify with so much of what you talk about. My son turns 11 in 2 weeks, and he is on the autism spectrum, but he doesn't present that way. He would be, you know, probably considered Asperger's. He's brilliant. He has lots of things, but pragmatic speech is still a big time challenge. He's got sensory processing disorder, ADHD, generalized anxiety. My daughter, again, a whole bunch of different things. The thing that's interesting, and again, you're 5 years ahead of us, all right, in your journey. He got diagnosed right around 4 or 5, so early identification. And a lot of the same things that you described, right? It's often neurological, gets described and bucketed as behavioral, right? Without any kind of understanding. Right. I mean, there were the school systems when we were getting his IEPs telling us that you don't want labels. And I haven't shared my story with you, but I like grew up with labels. I was run over by a truck. My left arm was torn from my body, reattached, all that stuff. So like a bunch was embedded in that. And I just said to them, I said, the problem is that you view it as a label. I view it as a path to help support my kid in the ways that he needs. And I said, so I don't know that I'm the one that has a problem with the label. I think you're the one that has a problem with the label.
Go daddy.
And like, I mean, we had like a 3-hour like thing, but like, people don't fuck with me and my wife when we're advocating for people we love, right? Like we find a path and we will absolutely hold it. And, but all of what you're talking about are these things that so many women, I say women, families struggle with understanding and early identification. And then again, you look back and it's like, oh, that makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, makes total sense.
But again, I mean, diagnosed or not, it doesn't matter. What I've learned a whole lot about myself by witnessing and learning what we've done, because again, it wasn't discussed when we were kids. It wasn't something that was there. And it's frankly largely not looked at. We just went to Magic Mountain a few weeks ago to do roller coasters. I get sensory overload really easy. I didn't even know what that was until we started understanding this with my son. Right. And so I wear earplugs in like really loud environments because I can still hear and everything is fine. Somebody noticed, they're like, why are you wearing earplugs? And I said, I get sensory overload. Right. Like, I don't need to defend it. I don't like, I'm not upset. I'm not right. It's like, oh, no, this is just who I am. And this is what I need to make myself okay in this environment. And it's like you describe it as these bumpers, right? In bowling. Right. But yet when people wear bumpers after a certain age in life, it's almost viewed as negative. And there's, again, it's that judgment, criticism, and shame. I got lit up because I hear you talking about all of it. I'm like, oh my God, yes. And again, you communicate it so beautifully and so accessibly. And again, it's perspective, understanding, meeting people where they are. Man.
Well, and Brian, I've had some of those meetings, where, I've had to I literally held, my hand up to a school counselor and said, actually, we don't say that in this room, and we've had meetings where, we had his third grade teachers were a team taught, and we were really excited because one of them said, oh, my son had ADHD, and I was always up at the school advocating for him. We have a 504. He was evaluated in third grade for gifted and talented, and he just was right underneath. So we have a 504 because it's really his executive function. And right now in 10th grade, we're like struggling to get everything turned in on time, but when he does, he makes straight A's, right? It's like, so, but in third grade, it was the behaviors, and which I've come to say, behaviors are a symptom. They are never the problem. Behaviors just are not the problem. The behaviors are not the problem with me, and they're not the problem with you. They're not the problem with your staff. They're not the problem with your teenager. Behaviors are a symptom.
Yes.
You have to be willing to look at what's the problem. Brian, you have these weird glass things on your face. What is that for? Why are you wearing those? Right. Well, I want to be able to see. Thank you. So these teachers were like, this is a problem. And I said, look, I've never taught, and I do not even remotely own the idea that I could ever get in a room of 38-year-olds and pretend to hold court. I just could not. Right.
Yeah.
I
couldn't.
Mad respect for anybody
Not
who can
chance.
do this.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got one running around in the back because he's got a 504 plan that says he gets to do that kind of thing.
Yep.
He's texting me right now asking for more crunchy pork things, just so you know. I mean, it's just like, he's in study hall, and so he's discovered pork rinds, right? It's just
I love this I love it on so many levels.
Yeah. So it's like, this is how it works. So they asked for him to be psychologically evaluated. The principal at the time, love her. The principal at the time said, okay, we're going to do this. So the school psychologist came in and observed like a bunch of times. We sat and had a big meeting with all of his teachers and the school counselor and the psychologist and the principal and the assistant principal. And when it was all done, the school counselor said, okay, so here's what we're writing up. It sounds like Nate does not need a behavioral plan. He needs a connection plan. Because here's the deal, Brian. When he connects with you, he will literally walk through fire over glass.
And everybody who he connects with adores him.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like he's their own almost. Yeah, totally.
If you don't, he's an ass.
Yeah.
I mean, just literally. And so he literally will connect with and that's what we tell his teachers now. It's like, you just connect with him. When he connects with you, you're good to go. And so she said, he doesn't need a behavior plan. He needs a connection plan. And when all the teachers and everybody had left the room, the principal was sitting next to me and she looked over and she said, how do you feel? And I said, oh my God, I feel vindicated. And she said, good. And then she basically told us, without saying this many words, we had to do this dog and pony show to prove to the teachers 100%. That they didn't know what they were talking about. So all that to say, becoming an advocate for something like this means, again, going back to literacy. So Attitude Magazine and all the stuff that goes along with that became one of our best sources. We listened to podcast after podcast after podcast after podcast. We learned about the medications, what they do and why they do it. So he does have combined type. He has generalized anxiety and he has been on medication since he was 6. Mm-hmm. And he does, he's got, rejection sensitive dysphoria because one of the things that people don't understand about when you have an ADHD diagnosis, you're 80% more likely to have another diagnosis that people will likely point to as the problem. So if he really did have oppositional defiant disorder, then it would be more likely that he would actually have ADHD and that, right? Just because that's how the neurodiversity works. But when we understand things and we're willing to be literate in this area, then it fuels our ability to advocate for, to help them understand themselves, to, go to the schools and say, look, you need more education. I cannot tell you how many teachers I have sent the link to Attitude. If you're not familiar with Attitude Magazine and ADHD or ADD is something that you are dealing with or learning about, it is a fabulous source. They have podcasts, they have all of it. And you can actually get a paper magazine if you need it. But I've sent that link to so many, and being able to sit down with my son and say, look, bud, you have a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. Mm-hmm. That's the impulse control. But he has rejection sensitive dysphoria. If I even talk sternly, why are you yelling at me?
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not yelling because I'm a yeller. That's, I hit that point, bad mommy moments where I slam doors and pictures fall off walls.
Yep. I get it. And
I might yell at you, but I'm more likely to stomp off and slam a door.
Based on what I know about the similarities with our kids, and this is not a bash on kids who or parents who have neurotypical children. It's just that, again, the perspective is you really don't. It's a completely different household when you are in a household with neurodiversities or multiple neurodiversities within multiple people, and when you don't. And you're right. I mean, it's one of those things that sometimes there's no more to give. That's why they have respite care for these things, right? I know. And it's just interesting because, again, that perspective is so different. But what you even suggested, and it's super interesting. One of the core concepts I teach around human connection is ultimately safety, right? Like almost everything we do to protect ourselves is because, or inability to connect is a desire to protect ourselves. I literally frame it out. I teach it all, but the concept is the second you protect yourself, you guarantee you're going to disconnect yourself. Right. From being seen and understood and being connected to the deepest level. And the second you protect yourself, you guarantee you're going to disconnect yourself from who you are and what you want. Right. The connection problem also means that the adults in the room who are there designed to be the ones to facilitate an environment of safety are incapable of doing so because they themselves struggle to tolerate what they don't understand and the behaviors and what they're communicating with these kids. And it creates this resistance and this disconnect. So the connection and it's when the kid feels safe.
Yeah.
Right. To be who they are and know that they have a safe place to land, because otherwise they bottle it up and it'll get even worse. To the point on even like science, though, I mean, that was something that I just want to bring awareness to. I don't think I've ever said this on the show or in anything I've talked about. I know that I have said that my son is on medication as well, but we did neurofeedback for both of our kids as well. And what the guy who did the neurofeedback, he also is the one who has continued with different evaluations. Immediately when he saw our son's brain scan, said, your son is a perfect candidate for stimulant medications. Mm-hmm. And it's scientifically proven. We all know there's alpha, beta, theta, right? There's multiple different brain waves. His alpha waves are like non-existent. Like, and so that will actually supplement with like what his natural brain is producing. We also have different neurofeedback conditioning that's actually allowing him to change and change the dynamics of those things. But even as it relates to like screens, we get really upset, but no alpha waves, watching screens actually produces theta waves, which regulates everything. So it's like we could say it's too much screen time, but at the same time, like it actually is helping his brain regulate, right? And so it's when we understand, we can actually have compassion and acceptance and then advocate. And that's, I think, so much what you even teach at the core of everything is this concept of core values is just learning to be able to advocate for yourself.
Absolutely.
In every way that you need to ensure that you have safety, to ensure that you're being seen, to ensure that you've got the guardrails that you may need on those bumpers when they're there. And when did that become bad? Right? Like that's the funny concept.
Yeah. For women, I think it becomes bad at like the first time we go out in public, right? As 2-year-olds, right? It's like how we're presented to the world. Women are presented to the world as how we look, whereas boys are presented to the world in general. This is not everybody does this. And I know there are a lot of people who are much more enlightened than what I grew up in. But in general, boys are presented to the world in what they do, whereas girls are presented in how they look. And so I think that's when it starts. And then as we move through school, if the number of women in Gen X that are being diagnosed with ADHD are huge. And many adults get diagnosed in your situation when their children are diagnosed because it is proven that it is a genetic thing. And so, of course, my son is not genetically ours, but we're looking around going, are you sure? Because it might be. But back to the safety piece, I didn't understand how to connect with him. And so at 4 and 5 years old, he was getting big enough. I'm 5'1.5". I'm little. And at 4 and 5 years old, he was getting big enough that he would like beat the crap out of me. And I saw a counselor at, employee relations, it's like the whatever it's called anymore in your work environment. And she actually said, if you need to just shut yourself in a room, it's okay. So I did that one night. My husband was not home. I shut myself in a room. And the next thing I know, I hear him talking to somebody. So I open the door because he's banging on the door, like throwing himself against the door because he's trying to connect and I've shut him off, right? And I didn't know. And I hear him talking and I tell this story now because it's funny, but at the time it wasn't funny. I opened the door and I saw him with my cell phone. And I'm like, who are you talking to? Well, he had just learned how to call 911 in school. My mom hurt me because he ran into the door. And I'm like, who are you talking to? I'm like, so we live on the border of a county, right? It's like 2 houses down is another county. And my cell phone was originally purchased when we were at a house in that county. So it's like, he's on the phone with 911 from that county. And I'm like, okay, seriously, I put myself in the office. It's like, he threw himself against, I'm like, why am I defending myself? But then I thought, but this is serious because what if they take him away, right? If somebody comes. While I'm on the phone with her, I hear him on the phone with somebody else. I'm like, what in the world? He picked up the house phone, which is now our county. And so in one hand, I had one county's 911, and in the other hand, I had another county's 911. Now, when you talk about people in neurotypical homes, they don't deal with this stuff.
No, they don't deal with stuff like that. Yes. I laugh just because there's so many stories we could share. Oh my goodness. So
finally I just said to the cell phone lady in the other county, I said, okay, I got my county on the line here. Can I talk to them? Sure. No problem. So I did. And fortunately, it was a real blessing that this woman said, because I said, I gave him his medicine and it hasn't kicked in. We're just getting a diagnosis of ADHD and all this stuff. And she said, look, I've got deputies in the area. Do you want one to just kind of stop by just to check, just to talk to him? And I said, sure, having a deputy stop by would be great. He took off to his room, right? And so it was a really good learning opportunity. He's never forgotten it, but it made it very clear to me that locking myself in the room when he's that upset is not going to work, but I couldn't just keep pushing him. So learning this concept of feeling safe was not just about me. It was also about him.
Completely.
He was locked out of this room. Bless his heart, and being willing to say, your brain doesn't work like my brain does. But now at 16, I get to say, I'm really in a rough spot right now. Can you maybe not push so hard on me? Right. Yeah. And help me understand your thought process here. And he's starting to learn to articulate it, but executive function is further behind. Yeah. And I keep having to tell his English teacher is on his 504 team. And I'm like, he has trouble remembering turning things in. He has now and not now time. There's not 5 minutes from now. There's not an English class later today. And there's not even an English class earlier. It's now or it's not now. And if he doesn't remember to turn his homework in while he's in front of you, it's done. It's like, it's gone. And, so we're getting ready to probably adjust his 504 plan to put something in there to kind of help. Yeah. So again, it goes back to, and he learned this in elementary school because this is the school system that actually taught Covey's 7 Habits to elementary school students because there's a children's version. Seek first to understand and then be understood. And sometimes you have to understand yourself in order to be able to do that because you have to do this from a place of what you said full. But being able to do that matters. And when you're willing to say, I don't have to have all the answers and I have plenty to learn, and being in a student mindset, it's going to change absolutely everything that you do.
That's right. It's spot on. There is no doubt you have communicated that you want to leave everything better than you found it. And I have no doubt that you do that. You go in and just the way you operate, how you move, how you connect, your energy and your heart are felt. And I'm grateful that you're in the world doing the work that you're doing, my friend.
Thank you.
I know that you have a program around core values. You've got some beta stuff that's going on. Could you tell us a little bit about how people can find you, where they can access that? We'll obviously have it in the show notes as well. And then I'd love for you to leave us with a closing thought.
Yeah, my business is called The Intentional Optimist. So theintentionaloptimist.com. At the top of the page are some buttons. One of them is all my free downloads, which makes it super easy if you want some easy access stuff. One of them is a core values exercise, but I also have a core values digital course that's simple. And depending on what kind of level you are at currently in your own awareness and the things that you already do, you might be able to walk through that paper. You might do well with the little digital course. But if you're really interested in going deeper and really changing the course of what you do, I tend to work with millennial, female CEOs, founders, executives. That's kind of my wheelhouse. I don't know what it is, but they relate, and it's just, they're at this perfect time in their lives for them to really make some differences. And I do have a beta program going. I'm only accepting 10, and I have a couple of people in the pipeline, but it is the core values course. And then we have 6 coaching sessions around that, in which I am your sounding board and I push back and I help you go deeper. Brian, about 90% of the people that come to me for core values work think they know their core values. 100% of them do not. They might know one, right? They might know one, but 100% of them do not truly know their core values. And it just revolutionizes everything that they do. So that's where you can find me, or Instagram or LinkedIn. Those are my favorite places to hang out. I'm also on Blue Sky now as well. But you're going to get different pieces of me at different. LinkedIn's very businessy. Instagram's very happy. Blue Sky is a little more theology and political stuff. So depending on what your proclivities are and where you want to interact, that's where you can find me. And I'm happy to respond to DMs. Just tell me you heard about me here, and I'll respond.
That's beautiful, my friend. So, I'd love for you to just leave us with a closing message from your heart.
From my heart is going to go all the way back to thinking for yourself. If we are not willing to do that, we are not giving ourselves permission to be everything that we were created to be. And if you're not showing up as you, it is not only the most selfish thing you can do because you're in that protection mode, but it is the least altruistic thing you could ever do. Sometimes we think that showing up as ourselves is too much, but the reality is you are supposed to bring something to the table, and we need you to bring that to the table. And if you don't, we are missing out. So please think for yourself and bring the whole whatever you are to wherever you're going. And if if we can't handle it, that's on us, right? So please, that is my prayer for you, is that you would do that.
Thank you for bringing it all for us. It definitely was evident. You brought all of who you are to the table today, and it was extremely pleasurable to navigate this conversation, learn more about your story, and I really enjoy interacting with you. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. It is my privilege. Thank you.
Awesome. And for those of you that just saw Andrea flip open her lid and jump in, she really clearly outlined the level of conditioning that happened multi-generationally that caused a way of her thinking and believing. But despite her ability to have had other perspective, it still took years for her to actually evaluate and find what was going to be most real, most true, and most aligned for her. But it did start with asking the questions. It does evolve with asking even deeper questions and exploring curiosity. But if you can't meet yourself where you are, you can never meet someone else where they are. If you don't know how to make safety for yourself, you don't know how to create safety for others. And so the ultimate gift you can give to the world, for those of you who care, is actually to do exactly what she outlined, which is to align with who you are, do the work, and the dividends will pay for decades. It's going to require you to flip open your lid. Scan your can.
What you can probably tell by now is that I love telling these stories, but what I love even more is the impact that's coming from them. You see, we're on a mission to impact over 1 billion lives as quickly as possible, but to do that, we need you. See, we believe that moved people move people. And so all I'm asking is if you've resonated, connected with any of the messaging, please consider commenting, sharing, leave a rating and review. Thank you so much for tuning into Flipping the Lid. And if you want more information on the show, how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or any of the other details, head over to flippingthelid.com. We'll see you there.